In the late 1990s and early 2000s, Burberry's signature beige, black, and red check pattern became one of the most recognized fashion motifs in Britain for precisely the wrong reason. The pattern showed up on a baseball cap that became closely associated in British tabloid coverage and popular culture, with a working class youth subculture the press had labeled with a derogatory slang term, and with football hooligan groups who adopted the check as a kind of uniform. Counterfeit versions flooded markets and street vendors, making the pattern even more ubiquitous and even harder to distinguish in a stranger's eyes from the genuine article. By the mid 2000s, the association had become so strong and so damaging that several UK pubs and clubs reportedly banned customers wearing the check pattern outright. And Burberry, a company whose entire commercial value rested on being perceived as a premium British heritage brand, found its most recognizable pattern functioning as a punchline rather than a status symbol. The company's response was drastic. It discontinued the baseball cap entirely, dramatically scaled back how often the check pattern appeared across its product line, pursued aggressive legal action against counterfeiters, and spent years deliberately repositioning itself upmarket, away from the exact customer base that had, in pure sales volume terms, been buying enormous quantities of Burberry branded merchandise. Sit with that for a second, because it's genuinely strange from an ordinary business perspective. A company had a product that a huge number of people wanted to buy and wear. Normally, that's the entire goal of being in business. Burberry looked at that popularity and treated it as an emergency. Not because the counterfeits were costing them direct revenue, though they were, but because the popularity itself, real and counterfeit combined, was actively destroying the thing that made the genuine product valuable to the customers Burberry actually wanted to keep. This is the paradox sitting at the center of nearly every serious luxury brand strategy. And once you understand it clearly, you'll see why so many of these companies work as hard to keep certain customers away as they work to attract others. Here's the mechanism in its simplest form, and it comes from an actual academic framework used in luxury brand management, not just intuition. Think of brand desirability less like a light switch on or off and more like a piece of slang that spreads through a culture. A word or phrase that starts inside a specific, small, culturally sharp group carries real currency precisely because using it signals membership in that group. The moment it gets picked up by everyone, parents, advertisers, people who have no real connection to where it came from, it doesn't just stay cool while becoming more common. It actively stops being cool, sometimes overnight, because the entire value of the word was never really in its sound or meaning. It was in the exclusivity of who used it and who understood it. Luxury brand desirability behaves almost identically. A logo or pattern that signals membership in an exclusive group only works as a signal for as long as it remains genuinely exclusive. And the instant it becomes common enough that literally everyone recognizes it, and plenty of people who couldn't afford it are also wearing counterfeit or diffusion line versions of it, the signal collapses, sometimes taking years of brand equity down with it. My name is Alex, and I spend a strange amount of time reading luxury marketing academic literature and brand management case studies because it turns out there's a genuine, well-developed body of theory behind why these companies treat overexposure as one of the most dangerous things that can happen to them. More dangerous, in many documented cases, than simply not selling enough. Here's what we're covering today. The academic framework luxury marketing theorists use to explain why brands need a very specific, narrow customer base at the top, even while selling much cheaper items to a wider audience underneath it. The full story of Burberry's overexposure crisis and the specific, deliberate steps the company took to claw back its exclusivity once it recognized the damage. The industry-wide trend of major fashion houses killing off their own lower-priced diffusion lines. Brands they built and marketed for years, specifically because those lines were undermining the value of the main label. The customer relationship management system some luxury retailers use to actively identify and cut off buyers suspected of being resellers rather than genuine customers. And the aggressive legal strategy behind counterfeit litigation, because protecting a trademark in court is, in large part, protecting the same exclusivity mechanism this entire video is about. This isn't a video suggesting luxury brands are villains for not wanting to sell to everyone. It's a video about a genuinely counterintuitive piece of business strategy. Deliberately turning away paying customers, because in this specific industry, more customers can sometimes mean less value for everyone involved, including the company itself. Quick thing before we get into it, I put together a free breakdown of how luxury brand customer tiers actually work, based on real marketing case studies, so you can see where a given brand is trying to position you as a customer based on what you're being offered. Links in the description. I only ask for an email to send you the breakdown. Let's talk about the actual academic model behind this, because it's more precise than just exclusivity is good. Luxury marketing researchers, notably French academic Jean-Noël Cafferer, whose work on luxury brand strategy has shaped how the industry thinks about this for decades, describe something often called the luxury customer pyramid. At the very top sit a small number of ultra-wealthy clients who buy the most expensive, least accessible pieces, custom orders, the rarest editions, items that may never even be publicly advertised. Beneath them sits a wider tier of affluent but not ultra-wealthy customers, buying core, recognizable products at full price. Beneath that sits a much larger base buying accessible entry point items. The perfume, the sunglasses, the small leather goods covered in other discussions of this industry. The entire structure only works according to this framework if the base stays proportionally large relative to the tiers above it. And critically, if the base doesn't start to feel like it's actually the same experience as what the top tier is buying. The moment the base becomes so large, so visible, and so associated with the brand's public image that the top tier no longer feels like they're buying something exclusive, the whole pyramid destabilizes from the top down, because the wealthiest customers, the ones actually driving the brand's prestige and its highest margin sales, are the first to leave once the brand stops signaling the kind of exclusivity they're paying for. This is the exact mechanism that broke in Burberry's case, and it's worth walking through the specifics because the case has become something close to a standard teaching example in business schools precisely because it illustrates the pyramid failure so clearly. Burberry's check pattern had originally been a relatively subtle design element used as a lining inside coats rather than as the dominant, highly visible motif it later became. Through the 1990s, the company expanded the check's visibility significantly, putting it on the outside of bags, scarves, and eventually the baseball cap that became the center of the crisis. A strategic choice at the time, intended to increase brand recognition and drive sales growth, which it did, dramatically in the short term. But making the pattern instantly recognizable also made it instantly counterfeitable and instantly adoptable by anyone, with or without a genuine product, simply by acquiring a cheap knockoff. Once the pattern became associated with a specific stigmatized subculture in the British press and popular imagination, the wealthier customers the brand actually depended on for its highest margin sales began quietly disassociating themselves from the brand entirely. Not because the coats had gotten worse, but because wearing recognizable Burberry no longer signaled what it used to signal, and in some circles had started signaling something close to the opposite. Burberry's recovery from this, led significantly by design director Christopher Bailey starting in the mid-2000s, is worth understanding in detail because it shows a pyramid framework being deliberately rebuilt rather than just theorized about. The company sharply reduced how often the check pattern appeared on new products, sometimes removing it almost entirely from entire collections for extended periods, treating a design element that had once been the brand's primary growth engine as something to actively ration rather than promote. It shifted marketing and runway presentation toward a more directly luxury, fashion-forward positioning, distancing itself visually and culturally from the mass market, logo-forward image that had developed. It also pursued sustained legal action against counterfeiters and unlicensed manufacturers producing check-patterned goods, treating counterfeit suppression not as a minor loss prevention issue but as core brand protection strategy, because every counterfeit item in circulation was, in the pyramid framework, actively degrading the signal value of every genuine item as well. This recovery took years, and it required Burberry to accept lower unit sales volume on some of its most recognizable, previously best-selling items, a direct, deliberate trade of near-term revenue for long-term brand positioning, the kind of decision that only makes sense once you understand the pyramid framework and the real damage overexposure was doing to the customers at its top. Let's talk about diffusion lines, because this reveals the same underlying logic playing out across an entire industry trend rather than one company's crisis. Through the 1990s and 2000s, many major fashion houses launched lower-price diffusion lines, secondary labels using a simplified version of the main brand's name and design language at a more accessible price point, intended to capture a broader customer base without directly diluting the main label. Marc by Marc Jacobs, DKNY, as a lower-price sibling to Donna Karan's core collection, Emporio Armani, and other secondary Armani lines beneath the flagship Giorgio Armani label, D&G, as a younger, cheaper counterpart to Dolce & Gabbana's main collection, were among the most prominent examples of this strategy across the industry. For a period, this worked as intended, expanding revenue and brand awareness among younger, less wealthy consumers who couldn't yet afford the main line but might aspire to it eventually. Starting in the 2000s, a striking number of these diffusion lines were quietly or explicitly shut down, restructured, or folded back into the main brand, a trend widely covered in fashion industry trade press at the time. Marc Jacobs discontinued Marc by Marc Jacobs entirely in 2015, consolidating everything under the main Marc Jacobs label. Dolce & Gabbana folded D&G back into the main brand around the same period. Several other houses restructured or eliminated similar secondary lines over the following years. Industry analysis at the time consistently pointed to the same underlying concern driving these decisions. The diffusion lines had succeeded too well at reaching a broad customer base, to the point that the visual and cultural association with a cheaper, more accessible product line was beginning to bleed backward onto the main label's prestige positioning, the exact pyramid collapse dynamic Burberry experience, playing out through deliberate brand architecture rather than an accident of overexposure. Killing a functioning, revenue-generating product line is not a decision companies make lightly, and the fact that so many houses reached the same conclusion around the same period suggests this wasn't isolated, brand-specific mismanagement. It was an industry-wide recognition that the diffusion line strategy itself had a structural flaw once it succeeded at scale. Now, let's talk about something considerably more targeted and, to most customers, entirely invisible: the practice of actively identifying and cutting off individual buyers suspected of reselling rather than genuinely wanting to own and use a product. This is distinct from the broader dealer-level gray market policing covered in discussions of specific brands elsewhere. This operates at the level of individual customer accounts. Several luxury retailers and high-demand streetwear and sneaker brands have been reported through industry sources and customer complaints that occasionally surface publicly to maintain internal customer relationship management systems that flag accounts showing patterns consistent with reselling rather than personal use. Purchasing multiple units of the same limited item in a short window, purchasing across multiple different accounts or shipping addresses that trace back to the same individual, or a purchase history skewed heavily toward the specific limited releases known to command the highest resale premiums rather than a varied personal use pattern of buying. Customers flagged this way have reported being quietly denied access to future limited releases, having online orders for hyped items canceled without clear explanation, or being told by in-store staff that a specific item simply wasn't available to them despite being visibly in stock, all without the brand ever stating outright that the customer had been identified as a suspected reseller. This might sound aggressive, but it follows directly from the same pyramid logic covered. Let's talk about counterfeit litigation, because this is where the abstract concept of brand protection becomes a very concrete, very expensive line item in a luxury company's operating budget, and it's worth understanding as an active strategic choice rather than simple legal housekeeping. Major luxury conglomerates spend substantial sums annually on legal enforcement against counterfeiters, trademark infringement lawsuits, customs seizure programs working with border agencies worldwide, and, in some notable cases, civil suits against landlords and marketplace platforms found to be knowingly hosting counterfeit sellers. This spending frequently exceeds what a purely financial calculation of counterfeit-related lost sales would justify on its own, because the primary damage counterfeiting does isn't lost sales to the counterfeit item itself. Someone buying an obviously fake handbag from a street vendor for $20 was likely never going to buy the genuine $4,000 version regardless. The primary damage is the same pyramid collapse dynamic covered throughout this video. Every visible counterfeit in circulation, regardless of who bought it or why, dilutes the exclusivity signal for everyone, including genuine customers who paid full price. This is why luxury companies pursue counterfeiters so aggressively, even in cases where the financial recovery from a successful lawsuit is modest compared to the legal costs involved. The lawsuit itself and the deterrent effect on future counterfeiting operations is protecting something considerably more valuable than the specific units seized in any one case. Let me walk through a concrete scenario. because seeing how this plays out for an actual customer clarifies the mechanism better than discussing it abstractly. A man we'll call Tobias has built a modest but genuine collection of limited sneaker releases over several years, buying maybe 6 to 8 pairs annually. Always sizes he actually wears, always items he keeps or occasionally trades directly with other collectors rather than reselling for profit. After a particularly hyped release where he successfully purchased 2 pairs in different sizes, planning to keep one and gift the other to his brother, his account was flagged and he found himself unable to purchase the brand's next several limited releases despite showing up early, entering raffles correctly, and doing nothing he considered unusual. When he eventually reached a customer service representative willing to discuss it candidly, he learned that purchasing 2 pairs of the same release in a short window, even for a legitimate personal reason, had triggered the same algorithmic flag used to catch actual bulk resellers, and that the system had no easy way to distinguish his situation from someone buying a dozen pairs purely to flip on a resale platform. Tobias hadn't done anything wrong by any reasonable definition, but he tripped a detection system built to catch a behavior pattern that happened, in his specific case, to overlap innocently with his own. Now, compare that to a different case a woman we'll call Selena, who runs a small, semi-professional resale operation, purchasing multiple units of limited releases across several different accounts and shipping addresses, specifically to maximize how many units she can acquire before a release sells out, then listing them on resale platforms within days at a significant markup. Selena's account activity is, by any reasonable measure, precisely the pattern these detection systems are designed to catch, and after several successful cycles of buying and reselling, her primary account was permanently banned from future purchases, with the brand's terms of service citing suspected commercial resale activity as the specific reason. Selena's response, discussed candidly in an online reseller community forum, was simply to set up new accounts under different names and shipping addresses, treating the ban as a cost of doing business rather than a genuine deterrent, which illustrates something important about the limits of this entire enforcement approach. Individual account flagging can catch and inconvenience casual resellers and, unfortunately, occasionally innocent enthusiastic buyers like Tobias, but it struggles considerably more against a determined, organized reseller willing to continuously create new identities to route around the restriction. There's a third perspective worth adding from someone who worked inside a luxury retailer's customer experience team rather than as either type of buyer. A woman we'll call Farah spent several years managing customer escalations for a major fashion house's online retail operation, and she's discussed in a professional networking interview after leaving the role how much internal debate existed around where to draw the line on account flagging. She described genuine tension between the loss prevention and brand protection teams, who wanted aggressive, wide net flagging criteria to catch as much reselling activity as possible, and the customer experience team, who dealt directly with frustrated, genuinely loyal customers like Tobias, who'd been caught by overly broad detection rules and threatened to abandon the brand entirely over the experience. She noted that the company never fully resolved this tension satisfactorily, adjusting the flagging thresholds repeatedly over the years in response to customer complaints on one side and rising resale activity on the other, without ever finding a version of the system that didn't produce some rate of frustrating false positives among genuine customers. Farah also noted something that rarely comes up in public discussion of these systems, that the company tracked a specific internal metric estimating how many genuine, high lifetime value customers were lost each year due to false positive flagging, and that this number, while never large enough to change the fundamental policy, was taken seriously enough at a leadership level that it was reviewed quarterly alongside estimated resale activity, prevented, treated as a real cost of doing business rather than an acceptable rounding error, which suggests these companies understand the trade-off they're making even when the systems themselves remain blunt enough to occasionally get it wrong. Let's talk about why brands accept this cost: frustrated genuine customers, ongoing legal expenses, discontinued revenue-generating product lines, rather than simply embracing the larger customer base and higher short-term sales volume that abandoning all of this would provide. The answer traces back to the pyramid framework covered at the start. A luxury brand's actual long-term value isn't measured primarily in unit sales volume. It's measured in sustained pricing power and the willingness of the wealthiest tier of customers to keep paying full price, sometimes significant premiums, for the privilege of being associated with a brand that has successfully maintained its exclusivity. Once that willingness erodes, once the top tier decides the brand no longer signals what they're paying for, rebuilding it, as Burberry's multi-year recovery demonstrated, is slow, expensive, and not guaranteed to succeed at all. Companies that have watched a competitor go through this kind of collapse have every incentive to accept the smaller, more controlled costs of active exclusivity management, rather than risk the much larger, much harder to reverse cost of a full pyramid collapse. This same pyramid logic extends into how luxury brands manage their presence across different geographic markets. An angle worth mentioning because it shows the exclusivity strategy operating at a scale far beyond individual customer accounts or single product lines. Rapid expansion into new, high-growth markets has historically posed a version of the same risk covered throughout this video. A market flooded too quickly with a brand's products, particularly through aggressive department store placement or licensing deals with local partners more focused on short-term volume than long-term brand positioning, can generate the same overexposure dynamic that hit Burberry domestically, just applied across an entire country or region rather than a single subculture. Several major luxury houses have, at various points, deliberately slowed their own expansion into fast-growing markets or restructured existing distribution agreements to bring more direct control over how and where their products appeared, specifically in response to concerns that local partners were prioritizing volume in ways that risked the brand's positioning over the medium and long term. This mirrors almost exactly the tension between short-term revenue and long-term brand equity running through every other mechanism covered in this video, just resolved at the level of national market strategy rather than individual transactions. Here's a 6-part protocol worth understanding whether you're navigating luxury retail as a genuine enthusiast or simply trying to make sense of why a purchase sometimes feels harder than it should. Rule 1. Understand that a brand declining to sell you something, whether through a waiting list, a canceled online order, or a flagged account, is very often not a reflection of anything you did wrong as an individual. It's frequently an algorithmic or policy-level response to a pattern that happens to overlap with legitimate behavior, and taking it personally usually isn't warranted even when it's genuinely frustrating. Rule 2. If you're a genuine collector or enthusiast rather than a reseller, be aware that buying multiple units of the same limited item, even for entirely legitimate personal reasons, can trigger the same detection systems built to catch commercial resale activity, and spacing out purchases or explaining your intent directly to a sales associate in advance can sometimes prevent an otherwise avoidable flag. Rule 3. Recognize that a brand discontinuing a diffusion line or scaling back a previously ubiquitous logo or pattern isn't necessarily a sign the company is struggling. It's frequently a deliberate, costly decision to protect long-term brand positioning at the expense of short-term sales volume, and understanding this can help you interpret these moves accurately rather than assuming financial distress. A brand pulling back from mass visibility right after a period of record sales growth is, if anything, often a sign of a company paying close attention to its own positioning rather than a sign of trouble. Rule 4. If authenticity and craftsmanship matter more to you personally than the specific exclusivity signal a brand is trying to protect, consider that diffusion lines and more accessible tiers, even discontinued ones still available secondhand, often represented genuinely well-made products that lost commercial viability for brand positioning reasons rather than quality reasons, meaning the secondhand market for these discontinued lines can offer real value, disconnected from the exclusivity game entirely. Rule 5. Understand that aggressive counterfeit litigation, while sometimes framed publicly as consumer protection, primarily protects the brand's own exclusivity mechanism, which is a legitimate business interest but not the same thing as pure altruism, and factor that distinction in when evaluating a brand's public statements about why it pursues counterfeiters as hard as it does. Rule 6. If you're building a genuine relationship with a brand or retailer over time, consistent, transparent, moderate purchasing behavior, buying what you actually intend to use, communicating clearly with sales staff about your intentions, generally builds the kind of trust that keeps you out of the algorithmic gray zone where casual enthusiasts and organized resellers unfortunately sometimes get treated the same way. One reframe matters more than the rest here. Luxury brands don't avoid mass adoption because they dislike money or because they're indifferent to revenue. They avoid it because, in this specific industry, uncontrolled mass adoption is one of the few forces capable of destroying the very asset the entire business is built on. Burberry's crisis wasn't caused by a competitor or a recession, it was caused by too many people wanting the product too badly, in a form the brand could no longer control the meaning of. Every diffusion line quietly discontinued, every reseller account flagged, every counterfeit lawsuit filed, traces back to the same lesson that crisis taught the entire industry. That popularity, unmanaged, is not automatically an asset in this business. It's a force that has to be actively shaped, or it will eventually shape the brand right back, usually in a direction nobody at the top of that pyramid ever wanted to go. The specific mechanisms change: a discontinued baseball cap, a shuttered diffusion line, a flagged customer account, a quota at the register, a slowed expansion into a fast growing market. But underneath every one of them sits the exact same calculation, weighing a real, immediate dollar of revenue against a harder to measure but ultimately larger dollar of long term brand equity, and choosing, again and again, to protect the second at the expense of the first. 3 takeaways. 1. The luxury customer pyramid framework explains why brands need a small, exclusive top tier and a much larger, accessible base simultaneously, and why the entire structure collapses if the base becomes too visually and culturally associated with the brand's public identity. 2. The industry-wide trend of major fashion houses killing their own profitable diffusion lines in the 2000s reflects a deliberate, costly recognition that these lines had succeeded too well at mass adoption, threatening the exclusivity of the main label they were built to support. 3. Individual customer account flagging for suspected reselling is a real, active practice at many luxury and streetwear brands, imperfect enough to occasionally catch genuine enthusiasts alongside actual resellers, but pursued anyway because uncontrolled resale activity represents the exact same pyramid collapse risk playing out one purchase at a time, whether the enforcement takes the form of a sophisticated algorithm or something as simple as a 2 per customer limit at the register. Lazy investing built more fortune than chasing every hyped drop ever will. The people who actually navigate this industry well aren't the ones angry that a brand won't sell them everything they want, whenever they want it. They're the ones who understood from the start that the difficulty itself was never a bug in the relationship, it was the entire product being protected. If you want to see the exact breakdown of how customer tiering actually works across major luxury brands, there's a walkthrough on my channel with the real details, no guesswork, just what actually works. Thanks for watching.